The sound of laughter cracked through the restaurant like glass under pressure. "Oh, look who showed up!" Vanessa's voice rang out, smooth and venomous all at once. "Why don't you sit at the servants' table, Gloria? It suits you." Her friends burst into laughter, the kind that isn't loud but cuts deeper for being controlled. I sat there at the far corner of Mariner's Pearl, my teacup trembling just slightly. The chandelier light hit my gray cardigan in a way that made it look even duller next to their silk and sequins. My son Ethan stood beside her, shifting uncomfortably. He didn't defend me. He just looked away. I didn't say a word. I lifted my cup, sipped my tea, and let them enjoy their moment. The waitress passed by, nervously pretending not to hear. 5 minutes later, the sound of footsteps changed the air. Henry, the restaurant manager, walked in with his calm composure. He bowed slightly and said, "Ma'am, your VIP table is ready." The silence that followed was so sharp it hummed. Every smirk froze. Every whisper died in their throats. And that, I suppose, was the moment the story really began. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. Ethan and Vanessa had made a reservation to celebrate the anniversary of their business success. In truth, the success they bragged about was built on my husband's sweat and mine. But that part of the story wasn't something they ever cared to mention. I had simply come to enjoy a quiet dinner. Alone. The irony was that the restaurant they were showing off, the one with its gold-trimmed menus and imported wine, was part of a chain that still carried my fingerprints on every recipe, every wall color, every design choice. But to them, I was just an old widow who didn't belong in a place like this. Vanessa had always known how to make humiliation feel elegant. She leaned against Ethan's arm, whispering loud enough for the nearby tables. "It's really sweet she still tries to go out. Some people just don't know when to stay home." Her friends giggled behind manicured hands. I could smell their perfume, sharp, artificial, nothing like the scent of real roses. The manager at the hostess stand looked nervous. He knew who I was. He knew whose name was on the deed. But I lifted a hand discreetly, telling him not to interfere. "Not yet." Ethan finally approached me, his tone halfway between embarrassment and annoyance. "Mom," he whispered through his teeth, "why are you here? You could have told me. You're kind of underdressed." I looked up at him and smiled faintly. "I'm not here for anyone's attention, Ethan. Just dinner." His eyes darted back toward Vanessa's friends, who were watching us like an audience enjoying bad theater. "Mom, please not tonight. We're meeting investors. You don't understand how these things work." He didn't see the irony in his words. He thought refinement came from money. I knew better. Refinement came from how you treated people who couldn't give you anything in return. Vanessa snapped her fingers toward a waiter. "Excuse me, can someone handle this? She's making the guests uncomfortable." The waiter froze. His name tag read Aiden. I recognized him. He'd been with the restaurant for years, trained under Henry himself. His eyes flickered toward me, confused. "It's fine," I said softly. "Just bring me another cup of tea, dear." Vanessa scoffed. "Tea? In a place like this?" "Of course." She turned back to her friends. "You see, this is what happens when people mistake good manners for social class." Their laughter picked up again, and I felt the burn of their judgment heavy and familiar. It wasn't the first time they made me feel small. But this time, something was different. Something in me had stopped trembling. I thought of Ray, my husband gone 5 years now, and how he used to say, "Let them laugh, Gloria. The sea has a way of returning everything that's thrown into it." He was right. The tide always comes back. From my seat I could see the reflection of the chandelier in the glass window sparkling above Vanessa's head. It almost looked like a crown. She thrived on attention, feeding off every whisper, every compliment, every envious stare. She had turned humiliation into theater, and tonight I was her prop. Ethan tried to quiet her, but she brushed him off. "It's not my fault she insists on showing up unannounced." Maybe she thought this was a community buffet. I felt something stir inside me, not anger, not yet, but a kind of cold recognition. The woman I had once welcomed into my home with open arms was now daring to treat me like a stranger in my own creation. Henry appeared not long after, moving with the quiet assurance that only comes from authority. The room shifted when he entered. Even Vanessa paused mid-sentence. He approached my table first, leaned down and said softly, "Everything all right, Mrs. Bennet?" I nodded once. "Quite all right, Henry." Then he straightened, turned toward Vanessa's table, and said in his measured voice, "Mrs. Bennet's VIP table is ready." A ripple moved through the room, like the air itself inhaled. Ethan's face drained of color. Vanessa blinked, then laughed nervously. "VIP? There must be some mistake." Henry's eyes didn't leave hers. "No mistake, ma'am. The owner has requested this arrangement personally." Vanessa looked at me, confusion flashing into fear, then back to defiance. "Owner," she repeated, her tone cracking at the edges. I didn't answer. I simply stood, adjusted my cardigan and picked up my purse. As I walked past their table, I caught the faint scent of her perfume again, bitter and floral like overripe lilies. I stopped just long enough to look her in the eye. "Enjoy your dinner, dear," I said. "And do try the lemon pie. It tastes like home." Then I followed Henry toward the center of the restaurant, where a table had been set with fresh flowers and fine china. Every eye followed me. Every whisper grew hushed. I sat down, calm as ever, though my hands still trembled faintly beneath the tablecloth. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. What I felt was something cleaner, colder, clarity. For years I had let them rewrite who I was, a burden, a has-been, a shadow from the past. But I was done being erased. The truth had a way of revealing itself at the right moment, and tonight was only the beginning. From the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan whisper something to Vanessa, probably trying to calm her. She kept glancing toward me, her laughter gone, her perfect posture stiff. I took another sip of my tea, letting the quiet settle. The ocean was visible through the windows beyond the terrace, dark and endless under the moonlight. It reminded me of all the nights I'd stood beside Ray in our first little restaurant cleaning tables after midnight, counting every tip, believing that hard work would buy us respect. But respect, I'd learned, was never something you could buy. It had to be demanded gently, firmly, without apology. As Henry walked away, I leaned back in my chair, feeling the steady pulse of my heartbeat slow. Around me the murmurs began again, softer, now uncertain. People were starting to wonder who I was, and maybe it was time they did. I glanced down at the cup in my hand, the tea, now cold, the lemon slice floating at the surface like a tiny sun. My reflection shimmered on it, a woman older, wiser, quieter than she once was. I lifted it one last time, murmuring to myself, "Let them laugh tonight. Tomorrow they'll learn what respect really means." And as the night deepened and the tide outside shifted against the shore, I knew this humiliation was only a spark. The storm was coming. 10 years earlier, the smell of butter and sea salt filled the tiny kitchen of our first restaurant. Ray stood by the grill humming an old Sam Cooke tune, while I arranged napkins on tables that wobbled slightly on their uneven legs. We called it Blue Harbor, though it was nothing more than a converted fish shack by the Charleston docks. The windows rattled when the wind came in from the ocean, but it was ours. Ray turned to me, flour dusting his cheek. "One day this place will shine like the lighthouse," he said. His smile had that same brightness, the kind that made you believe him even when you couldn't yet see the light. I remember the warmth of that moment, the feeling that the world for once was small enough to hold between our hands. We built everything together. Ray was the dreamer, I was the planner. We worked 16-hour days cooking shrimp gumbo and lemon pie for dock workers and tourists. Ethan was a teenager, then impatient and embarrassed by our simple ways. He'd sneak out after school, still wearing his apron, telling his friends his parents just ran a small local diner. He hated the word diner, as if it made us ordinary. But Ray would only laugh and say, "That boy will understand one day what real work tastes like." I wanted to believe it too. Ray died 5 years later suddenly from a heart attack. One moment he was seasoning the catch of the day, the next he was gone. The silence afterward was unbearable. The restaurant lights still flickered as if waiting for him to finish a sentence. I remember standing at his funeral, Ethan holding Vanessa's hand. She was his wife by then, polished and polite, not yet cruel but already distant. While I wept beside the coffin, I overheard her whisper to a friend, "Poor Ethan. Now he's stuck taking care of her." I pretended not to hear, but those words settled somewhere deep, a splinter under the skin that would never quite heal. After the funeral, Ethan visited only when he needed something. Mom, I have expenses, the condo, the car. Vanessa wants to redecorate. I gave him whatever I could. He never asked where it came from. He assumed it was Ray's savings or some small widow's pension. He didn't know the truth that Ray and I had expanded Blue Harbor into 6 thriving restaurants across the coast, each one built from years of quiet reinvestment. I never told Ethan about the full extent of what we owned. Maybe I was afraid he'd stop seeing me as his mother and start seeing me as a wallet. Maybe I already knew he loved me for what I could give, not for who I was. When Vanessa came fully into our lives, everything changed. She arrived like perfume, strong, expensive, and impossible to ignore. She was an influencer from Atlanta, always with a phone in her hand, taking pictures of herself next to things she didn't own. She looked at our restaurants as if they were stepping stones, not legacies. Once during a soft reopening of one location, she posed by the bar, telling her followers, "Our new venture is finally open." She'd never cooked a day in her life, but she smiled as though she'd written every recipe herself. I tried to stay gracious. I cooked for them when they visited, offered advice when they asked, and stayed silent when they didn't. But slowly I began to feel myself disappearing. Ethan stopped consulting me on business decisions. Vanessa introduced me at family gatherings with that careful tone meant to sound kind but carried a blade beneath. "This is Ethan's mother, Gloria. She used to have a little seafood place back in the day." Used to. As if everything Ray and I built was nothing more than a sentimental hobby that had expired with him. When Ethan suggested I take it easy, I understood what he really meant. "Step aside. Mom, you deserve to rest," he said. "Let us handle the operations. You'll still have your share, of course." He said it gently as if offering me a kindness, but I could see the relief in his eyes. They didn't want me involved. So I signed the paperwork transferring temporary control. The ink felt heavier than it should have. "We'll make you proud," he promised. I wanted to believe that too. Months later, they held a grand reopening of the flagship Blue Harbor Luxe. I wasn't asked to help plan it, but I went anyway. I wore my best blue dress, the one Ray had bought me for our 20th anniversary, and I brought a lemon tart, his favorite recipe. When I arrived, the valet looked confused but polite, probably assuming I was someone's housekeeper. Inside, the chandeliers gleamed, the walls painted in sleek white and gold. Vanessa spotted me immediately, her smile tightening. "Oh, Mrs. Bennett, how lovely. You came," she said, her tone strained. "Why don't you leave your dessert in the kitchen? We already have catering from Sullivan's." She said, "Sullivan's the way people say pedigree." During the event, reporters took photos of Ethan and Vanessa. When someone asked about the restaurant's origins, Vanessa stepped forward smoothly. "Ethan and I reimagined the brand together. It's a new chapter." I waited for Ethan to mention his father, to mention me. He didn't. A journalist approached me later and asked, "Were you involved in the early days?" I smiled and said, "You could say that. I just kept the lights on." He nodded politely, not realizing how literal that was. I left early, the lemon tart still untouched in the kitchen. On the way home, I threw it out. The crust crumbled between my fingers like a memory too old to hold. I spent that night staring at our old wedding photo, Ray in his white chef's coat, me beside him laughing with flour on my nose. "They don't remember us," I whispered to the picture. The house felt too big, too quiet. My phone stayed silent for weeks. Ethan didn't call. Vanessa posted photos online of expensive dinners, captions full of gratitude for our amazing investors. Not a word about family. Then one evening my friend Joan called. "Gloria, when are you going to stop letting them treat you like an employee?" I laughed softly, though it hurt. "They're my family, Joan. I just need patience." She sighed. "No, Gloria. You need respect." That word lingered after the call ended. Respect. I hadn't demanded it in years. I stood by the window looking toward the distant beam of the Charleston lighthouse, cutting through the fog. It had always been Ray's symbol for hope. I used to think it guided ships home. That night I realized it was guiding me. The waves crashed against the shore, steady and endless. Somewhere deep inside, a part of me began to harden, not in bitterness but in resolve. I whispered to the dark, "I'm not done yet." Maybe I had been too afraid to ask for dignity. Maybe I had mistaken silence for strength. But life, as Ray once said, has a way of forcing your hand. And in the distance, the light turned once more over the water, steady, patient, unblinking. The invitation never came. Weeks passed after the reopening, and I told myself it didn't matter that family dinners had always been full of tension anyway. But when I heard from a young waitress that Ethan and Vanessa were hosting an exclusive celebration for investors, my heart stung. "Just close family," the girl had said. Then her face fell when she realized who she was speaking to. I smiled to save her from embarrassment, though I could feel the floor tilt under my feet. Just close family. I suppose I no longer counted. That Saturday evening, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I wore a navy dress that fit well enough, simple pearl earrings, and a scarf Ray had given me before he died. I debated whether to go. My mind said no, but my heart couldn't bear another night alone. So I baked a lemon pie and drove to Blue Harbor Lux, the place that once felt like home. When I walked into the lobby, I could already hear the laughter and music from the private hall. Vanessa's voice carried above the rest, light, bright, and sharp as glass. When the doors opened, I saw her at the center of the room in a silver gown, surrounded by investors and influencers. Ethan stood beside her, smiling for photos, champagne in hand. The walls shimmered under golden lights, the air heavy with expensive perfume. It was all theater, and they were the stars. For a moment I just watched from the doorway. A few guests glanced at me confused. One of them leaned toward another and whispered, "Is she part of the staff?" I could feel the heat rise in my face. Then Vanessa spotted me. Her smile froze, then returned brighter, colder. "Oh," she said, voice lilting. "Mrs. Bennett, you came." She turned to a waiter. "There's a small table in the back near the service doors. Could you set her up there? We're a little full tonight." The laughter around her softened into awkward silence. Ethan's face tightened. "Mom, maybe it's quieter back there," he murmured, avoiding my eyes. I nodded. "Quiet, sounds perfect." I followed the waiter to a tiny table tucked near the kitchen. My lemon pie rested in my lap, like a secret I wished I hadn't brought. From where I sat, I could see the main table glittering with crystal glasses and seafood towers. Vanessa raised her flute. "To family and success," she announced. I lifted my water in silence. The room filled with the sound of forks and laughter. A guest nearby chuckled softly. "Every empire has its help, I suppose." Another answered, "She looks nice though." Sad. I pretended not to hear. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen mixed with their toasts until everything blurred together, joy for them, humiliation for me. A hand brushed my shoulder lightly. Henry, the restaurant manager, stood beside me. His expression was calm, but his eyes flickered with quiet fury. "Would you like me to move you to the front, ma'am?" he whispered. I shook my head. "No, Henry. Let them enjoy their spotlight." His jaw clenched. "Spotlights burn hot, ma'am. They always do." Then he walked away before anyone noticed. I pressed my hand over my chest, steadying my breath. The pie box under the table felt heavier by the minute. At the main table, Vanessa was still performing. She leaned into one of the investors and laughed loudly, touching his arm just long enough to make the gesture look rehearsed. When we took over the brand, she said it was charming but outdated. Ethan and I brought it to life again. The man nodded politely. I could tell he didn't know who I was, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Ethan smiled through it all, his expression hollow. He used to look like his father when he laughed, now he looked like a man pretending to enjoy his own lie. After a while, an influencer from the next table started live streaming the event, her camera sweeping over the guests and decorations. For a brief moment, the lens caught me sitting alone in the background holding a glass of water. The comments started rolling in almost immediately. "Who's the older lady? She looks lost. Is that Vanessa's mom or staff?" I didn't know then that the clip would spread online later, sparking a wave of speculation. All I knew in that moment was how small I felt watching my son's success built on the bones of my silence. When the music changed to something slow, Vanessa leaned over to Ethan, her smile fixed. "Don't look at her. It's bad optics." He rubbed his temple. "She's my mother, Vanessa." "Then act like it," she hissed, "and keep her out of the frame." My throat tightened. I didn't cry, not yet. But inside, something hard was forming, a quiet resolve that no longer cared about being liked. By the end of the evening, most of the investors had left. Vanessa was glowing from wine and attention. I waited until the room emptied, then walked up with the box in my hands. I brought something for you both, I said softly. Ray's lemon pie. Thought Ethan might like a piece. Vanessa's laugh came quick and brittle. That's sweet, but we're watching carbs. Ethan stood behind her saying nothing. I placed the box on the table and met his eyes. Someday you'll remember where sweetness comes from, I said, then turned and left before my voice could break. Outside, the night air was cool and smelled of salt. My hands trembled as I unlocked the car. The lights from the restaurant shimmered in the reflection on my windshield, gold dazzling hollow. I sat there for a long moment watching guests leave in their shiny cars, their laughter fading into the distance. It was strange realizing that I had become invisible in a world I built. I started the engine, but before driving away, I glanced once more at the glowing sign that read, Blue Harbor Lux. The word Lux glittered brighter than the rest, but it felt empty, like a promise rewritten by strangers. When I got home, I set the keys on the counter, and saw the pie still sitting on the passenger seat. I brought it inside, and placed it on the kitchen table untouched. The smell of lemon filled the room, soft and familiar. I thought of Ray, how he would have shaken his head muttering, "Pride makes fools out of good people." My phone buzzed. It was Joan. "How was it?" she asked. "It was everything I expected," I answered. "And nothing I'll forget." She sighed on the other end. "Gloria, they've forgotten who you are. Maybe it's time you remind them." After I hung up, I stood by the window and watched the lighthouse beam sweep across the dark sea. I used to see it as a comfort. That night it looked like an eye steady, knowing impossible to escape. The laughter from earlier still echoed faintly in my ears. I whispered to the quiet room, "They'll see Ray." Not out of anger but out of truth. Then, with a calmness I didn't fully understand, I took a deep breath and said out loud, "This ends now." The wind outside picked up, carrying the faint cry of the gulls over the waves. And for the first time in years I didn't feel like the tide's victim. I felt like the current itself, ready to turn. 2 weeks after that humiliating dinner, I was in my garden pruning the hydrangeas, when the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the quiet. Ethan's black car pulled up beside the porch, gleaming like it didn't belong in front of my old house. He got out wearing a suit too expensive for an early morning visit. I wiped my hands on my apron, half expecting him to finally apologize. Instead, he gave me the same tight smile he used to wear as a teenager when he wanted something. "Mom," he said, walking up the steps, "I need a favor. A big one." I waited. He didn't even sit down before opening his laptop on the porch table. "There's an opportunity to expand Blue Harbor Lux to Miami. We need investors fast, but if I can front $250,000, we'll secure the deal." He turned the screen toward me, showing glossy renderings of a new restaurant. "You've got savings, right? I'll pay you back in a few months." I stared at him. "After what happened at the dinner, you still think I'm your bank?" He blinked, genuinely confused. "This isn't personal, Mom. It's business. You've always believed in me." "I believed in your father," I said softly. "That's not the same thing." Ethan frowned, the polite mask slipping. "You're my mother. Family helps family." The garden was still, except for the wind moving through the leaves. I took a breath, felt the words form before I could stop them. "No." He froze. "What did you just say?" I said no. He laughed, startled, as if I'd told a joke. "You're serious?" "For once," I said. "I've helped enough." The silence stretched. His jaw tightened. "You always make things harder than they have to be. Vanessa's been under so much stress." "Vanessa's stress isn't my problem," I cut in. "And neither is your debt." His voice sharpened. "Debt? You don't know what we're dealing with." "No, Ethan," I said quietly, "I don't. Because you never tell me anything until you want money." He slammed the laptop shut. "Unbelievable. You're selfish. Dad would have supported me. Your father believed in hard work, not handouts." He stood pacing. "You'll regret this." I looked up at him from my chair. "Maybe. But I'll regret it less than I've regretted every time I said yes." He left without another word, the car door slamming like thunder. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. I sat there for a long time, hands trembling, heart pounding so hard I could hear it. For years I'd been afraid of that word no. I thought saying it meant losing him. But as I listened to the quiet settle, I realized losing myself had been worse. When I finally stood, the garden seemed brighter. The air felt lighter. I called Joan. "I did it," I said. "Did what I said, no." She gasped. "Good for you, Gloria. But brace yourself. Narcissists don't handle rejection quietly." I smiled faintly. I'm done being quiet. That evening, while washing the dishes, memories came rushing back. Ethan, at 16, asking for money for a school trip. Ethan at 24, begging for help with his wedding expenses. Ethan at 30, wanting funds for a down payment. Each yes had chipped away at something inside me. I thought I was teaching him love, I whispered to the window. But I was teaching him dependence. The phone rang again later that night. Vanessa's name lit up the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Gloria," her voice purred, though I could hear the edge beneath it. "Ethan's really stressed. You should reconsider. This isn't just about money, it's about legacy." I stared at the sink water still running. "Legacy is earned, not inherited." She gave a short laugh. "Without us, your husband's restaurants would fade." "They already faded," I said. "When respect left the table." There was a pause. Then the line went dead. I dried my hands and went to my small desk. The last of the evening light spilled across a framed photo of Ray and me, young and exhausted, covered in flour. I opened my journal and wrote, "Today I said no, not out of anger but out of self-respect." I underlined the word respect twice. Outside, the lighthouse beam cut through the dusk, steady and patient. For the first time, it didn't look like a memory, it looked like a direction. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from one of my longtime employees. "Mrs. Bennett, I overheard something you need to know. Ethan's telling investors he'll take over the company soon, said you're retiring." I stared at the text. A moment later, another message arrived, with a photo attached, a signature, mine, on a digital transfer document. Except, it wasn't my signature. My breath caught. Ethan had forged my name. I called Joan immediately. "He's trying to move ownership," I said. My voice shook more from disbelief than anger. "Get your lawyer," she said firmly. "And keep everything, every message, every copy." After the call, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills, the photo of Ray, the small plant I'd been meaning to repot. I realized how deeply I'd let guilt dictate my life. I'd mistaken love for servitude. If they want a war, I said out loud, they'll get one. But not the kind they expect. That afternoon, I drove to the downtown office where Henry managed operations. He met me in the lobby, surprise flickering across his face. "Mrs. Bennett," he said softly, "I didn't expect you." "Good," I replied. "Then, neither will they." He led me upstairs to the office that used to be mine, still smelled faintly of lemon polish and sea salt from the days I'd cleaned it myself. I sat behind the desk, feeling something powerful return to my chest. "Henry, I need every record from the last 2 years. Quietly. He hesitated, then nodded. "I'll get you the files tonight." I looked out the window at the harbor. The tide was high, the water churning, dark and restless. "It's time to clean house," I said. "No one needs to know until it's done." Henry studied me for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Welcome back, Mrs. Bennett." When he left, I opened the drawer on the right. Inside was an old metal box I hadn't touched in years. I turned the key, the click echoing like a heartbeat. Inside were deeds, certificates, tax forms, all proof that Blue Harbor, every location, every property, was still legally mine. I ran my fingers over Ray's handwriting on the earliest contracts. He'd signed each one with a flourish, a small anchor drawn beside his name. "Anchors keep you steady," he used to say, "even in rough waters." I smiled faintly. The waters were rough now, but I wasn't sinking. When I left the office, the streets were bathed in the glow of the setting sun. The reflection of the lighthouse shimmered faintly in the distance, and for the first time, I didn't feel like it was just shining for me. It was watching, waiting. As I locked the door behind me, I whispered into the cool air, "You tried to erase me, Ethan, but you forgot one thing." I paused, the keys cold in my hand. "I built the floor you're standing on." The city lights flickered on one by one across the harbor. I felt the old strength rise again, the kind that doesn't shout but endures, the kind that waits for the right moment to strike. That night, I took out a blank folder and wrote a name on the front in bold ink, Operation Lighthouse. The next morning, the rain came soft and steady, tapping against my kitchen window like a metronome. I sat with my coffee staring at the words I'd written on the folder, Operation Lighthouse. The name looked both ridiculous and righteous. It made me smile. I tucked the folder under my arm and drove downtown, the wipers beating rhythmically, the city blurred through gray drizzle. When I stepped into the Blue Harbor Group's headquarters, the receptionist blinked as if she'd seen a ghost. "Mrs. Bennett," she stammered, "we didn't know you were working," I finished. "Yes. Neither do my children. Let's keep it that way." She nodded quickly. Henry was waiting for me upstairs, standing beside the office door I hadn't entered in nearly a decade. "Welcome home," he said. The smell of lemon polish hit me again, familiar and grounding. "Everything's ready for you." I walked to the desk and placed my hand flat on the surface. "It's time we clean the house, Henry." He nodded, handing me a small USB drive. "Start with this. You'll want to see what your son's been doing with the accounts." When I inserted the drive into the computer, the screen filled with spreadsheets. Money flowing in circles that didn't make sense, transfers to accounts under VB Social LLC, Vanessa's initials. My lips tightened. "They built a side company. More like a funnel," Henry said. "It's where they've been moving funds from the Lux restaurants." "How much?" He hesitated. "Close to 200,000, maybe more." I leaned back in the chair. "Every dollar taken from Blue Harbor is a piece of Ray's work stolen. That ends now." We spent the rest of the day going through reports, pulling files, noting every discrepancy. I didn't feel tired, though I hadn't moved for hours. For the first time in years, I felt alive, not angry, not bitter, but purposeful. That was the difference. Anger burns fast. Purpose endures. By late afternoon, Henry looked up from the desk. "You should talk to Caroline Webb," he said. "She's the lawyer who handled the original incorporation. She'll know exactly how to protect you." "Call her," I said, quietly. The next morning I met Caroline in her small but immaculate office overlooking the harbor. She hadn't aged a day. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, her glasses resting low on her nose. "Gloria Bennett," she said warmly, standing to hug me. "It's been too long." "Not long enough," I murmured. "I need your help." She gestured for me to sit. Henry briefed me. "You still hold 72% of the shares. Legally, they can't move a dime without your signature." I handed her a printout of the fake document with my forged name. "Then explain this." Her smile faded. "Forgery," she said flatly. "It's serious. We'll fix it quietly. I can file a notice to freeze any pending transfers." "I want them to hang themselves first," I said. "I just need to make sure when they fall it's permanent." Caroline studied me for a long moment. "You sound like your husband when he negotiated his first lease." Then I'm on the right track. When I left her office, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking apart, streaks of sunlight spilling across the harbor. I took it as a sign. That evening, Henry sent me an audio file. I pressed play, and my son's voice filled the room. "Vanessa, once she's out of the picture, investors will see us as the real owners. Ethan, she's old, she'll give up soon." I played it twice, maybe 3 times. The first time I cried, the second time I didn't. The third time I wrote a note at the bottom of my folder. "Never underestimate a woman who's built an empire and buried a husband." Henry called soon after. "Do you want me to confront them?" "No," I said, "not yet. Let them think I'm still weak." He chuckled softly. "They'll regret that." "I'm counting on it." Over the next few days we worked like thieves in reverse, gathering back what was stolen. I requested audits of each restaurant, checked vendor contracts, traced transfers. Every time I discovered another lie, I felt less hurt and more focused. The numbers told a story of greed and arrogance, and I intended to rewrite its ending. By Friday, Caroline had drawn up new legal protections. Every property and bank account would now require dual verification, mine and hers. Ethan wouldn't know until his next transaction failed. I almost pitied him. Almost. That night, I sat at my kitchen table flipping through the papers I'd gathered. Underneath them was a photo of Ray taken at our very first restaurant. He was standing by the counter, arms folded, a proud grin on his face. Behind him, a sign he'd painted by hand. Blue Harbor. Honest food, honest work. Honest work. That phrase settled in my chest like a stone. I whispered, "They forgot Ray," but I didn't. The next morning Ethan called. "Why are you checking company accounts, Mom?" His tone was sharp, defensive. "Because they're mine," I said evenly. "You retired." I rested, I corrected. Not surrendered. Vanessa's voice broke in from the background. "You're sabotaging us, you want us to fail." "I want the truth," I said. "And truth doesn't fear inspection." The line went silent for a beat, then cut off. I set the phone down, calm as still water. Later that afternoon, Henry arrived with a sealed envelope. "Everything you asked for," he said. Inside were copies of deeds, ownership certificates, and one final report. "You own it all outright," he added. "They can't touch a cent." I exhaled slowly. Good. Because soon they'll try again. He hesitated at the door. "You're really going through with it, aren't you?" I met his eyes. "They taught me humiliation in public. Now I'll teach them humility the same way." Henry nodded once. "Then I'll be ready." When he left, I went to the window. The clouds had turned pink over the water, the lighthouse beam sweeping across the darkening sky. Its light hit my reflection on the glass, an older woman, weary but unbroken. For the first time I liked what I saw. I sat back down, opened the folder and added a new page. Phase 1, complete. Under it, I wrote, "Gather proof. Protect assets. Wait for the perfect audience." I closed the folder, sealing it like a promise. The rain began again, steady, patient, washing the city clean. I smiled at the sound. Storms, I thought, always start quietly. The following week moved like a chess game played underwater, slow, deliberate, heavy with silence. Ethan didn't call again, and Vanessa stayed invisible online, her social media accounts suddenly private. I suspected they were regrouping. That was fine. I was doing the same. Each morning I drove to different Blue Harbor locations unannounced. The chefs and waitstaff still greeted me with affection, though some tried to hide their surprise. I'd been a rumor to them for years, an owner who'd vanished into widowhood. Now I was back, walking through kitchens that smelled of garlic and lemon zest, listening to the rhythm of knives on cutting boards. It grounded me, reminded me of what I had built with my own hands. At the downtown flagship, I stood in the corner while the lunch rush unfolded. The young manager, a polite man named Jonah, nearly dropped his tablet when he saw me. "Mrs. Bennett, we didn't know you were visiting today." "I prefer when people don't," I said with a smile. "Tell me, Jonah, who's been approving vendor invoices lately?" "Mr. Bennett," he said. "Mostly online transfers. His wife sometimes signs as well." I nodded. "That stops now. From today forward, every approval comes through this office." He hesitated. "Should I inform Mr. Bennett?" I looked him square in the eye. "Not yet. Let's give him a surprise." That night I sat in the office with Henry, who was sorting through a pile of printed emails. "They've reached out to new investors," he said. 2 from Atlanta, 1 from Miami. They promised them access to Blue Harbor's full profit margins. "How?" I asked. "By listing themselves as primary owners." My stomach tightened. And those investors believed them. "They haven't seen proof yet," Henry said. "They're meeting them in 3 days at the Harbor Lux restaurant." A dinner meeting. A chill ran through me. "Then that's where it'll happen," I said. Henry looked up. "You mean?" "Yes. The truth needs an audience. Let's give them one." He smiled slowly. "Then I'll set the stage." For the next 3 days, we worked quietly. Henry contacted the investors under the guise of confirming reservations. I made sure the necessary documents, deeds, ownership records, tax filings were copied, certified, and sealed. Caroline, my lawyer, arranged for the company's official ownership to be displayed publicly if needed. "Once you reveal this," she warned, "there's no turning back. You'll humiliate them." I met her eyes. "They already did that to me. The only difference is, this time the truth will do the talking." On the 3rd day, I woke before dawn. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant crash of waves. I brewed tea, the same brand Ray and I had shared for decades, and set the mug beside his photo on the counter. "It's time," I whispered. I arrived at the restaurant an hour early. Henry had reserved my old corner table near the window, the same one I'd sat at during that night of humiliation. The morning light filtered through the glass, painting gold stripes on the polished floor. I could almost hear Ray's voice. Make them remember who you are, Gloria. By 7 that evening the restaurant glowed with soft amber light. I dressed simply gray slacks, a cream cardigan, my pearls. No armor but dignity. Ethan arrived first, crisp suit, nervous energy. He didn't notice me at the corner table as he greeted the investors at the main one. Vanessa came next wearing emerald green, her hair slicked back, her smile dazzling and hollow. The investors followed, 3 men and 1 woman, each carrying the polished confidence of people who deal in large sums of money. From where I sat I could hear every word. To new beginnings, Vanessa said, brightly raising her glass. We're expanding into Miami by summer. One of the investors, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, asked. And the current ownership structure, all clear? Ethan smiled too quickly. Absolutely. It's just us now. My mother retired years ago. I watched the lie fall effortlessly from his mouth, and for a heartbeat I almost pitied him. He truly believed power came from pretending. Then Henry entered the dining room. His voice carried easily but without force. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I understand you requested a word with the management. Vanessa's smile faltered. Actually, we're fine. But Henry wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me. Mrs. Bennett, he said clearly, your table is ready. The entire restaurant went still. Ethan turned his head, confusion flickering into panic. Mom, I stood slowly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. The investors' eyes followed me as I crossed the room, calm and steady. Mrs. Bennett, one of them said, politely standing. I didn't realize you were still involved with the company. I am the company, I said gently. Always have been. Vanessa laughed, too high-pitched. That's adorable. But there must be some mistake. Henry placed a thick binder on their table and opened it. These are the official records of Blue Harbor Group, signed and certified. As you can see, Mrs. Gloria Bennett retains 72% ownership. Vanessa went pale. Ethan's mouth closed, then opened again. This is crazy. That's outdated paperwork. Henry turned to the last page, an updated filing from the week before. My name was printed clearly, sealed by the state. The gray-haired investor leaned forward. So you're saying? I'm saying, I interrupted softly, that every restaurant you've visited, every recipe you've tasted, every dollar you were promised belongs to me. My husband and I built this empire from a shack by the docks. And I won't let greed ruin it. Vanessa pushed back her chair. You planned this. You wanted to humiliate us. I met her eyes. No, Vanessa. You did that yourself when you told me to sit at the servants' table. The silence that followed felt like the sea holding its breath. The investors stood slowly, shaking their heads. The woman among them looked at me with quiet respect. Mrs. Bennett, she said, it's been a pleasure meeting the real owner. One by one they left. Ethan tried to follow, but I held up a hand. Sit. He froze. Do you remember what your father used to tell you? I asked. That pride is louder than hunger. Tonight you proved him right. Vanessa glared, her mascara smudged. You can't just. I can, I said. And I did. Henry cleared his throat. Would you like me to escort them out, ma'am? I shook my head. No. Let them walk out on their own. They did, heads down, the sound of their footsteps echoing like waves hitting stone. When they were gone, I sat again at my corner table, the same seat where I'd once sipped tea under 1,000 judging eyes. This time the room was quiet, reverent. Henry approached softly. You did it, he said. I smiled faintly. No, Henry, the truth did. Outside rain began again, a gentle, rhythmic sound against the windows. I looked out toward the harbor, the beam of the lighthouse cutting through the dark. He'd be proud, wouldn't he? I murmured. Henry nodded. He'd say the tide finally turned. I picked up my cup of tea, letting the steam rise against my face. Then let it rise higher, I said. And as I watched the rain shimmer under the streetlights, I knew that everything had changed, but the real storm, the one inside the heart, was still waiting to break. By morning the video had already reached 1 million views. Someone in the restaurant had filmed the moment Henry called me Mrs. Bennett, the owner, and posted it online with the caption, "When karma serves dinner hot." My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Joan was the first to call. You're famous, she said, half laughing, half crying. You finally got your justice. I sat at the kitchen table, tea untouched, watching the clip play on my phone. There I was, calm, composed, walking to the center of the restaurant, while Vanessa's face drained of color. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing on the edge of a long, cold ocean and realizing the tide had finally gone out. By noon, the headlines started appearing. Charleston heiress publicly shamed by mother-in-law. The real owner of Blue Harbor revealed. The comments under the articles were brutal. Good for her. That woman deserves it. Vanessa's always been fake. Now everyone knows. I didn't post anything. I didn't reply to Joan's texts telling me to celebrate. Instead, I went outside, pruned the hydrangeas, and let the quiet soak through me. The world was cheering for me, but I wasn't sure if I was proud of what they were cheering for. When the doorbell rang that evening, I already knew who it was. Henry stood there holding 2 envelopes. "You might want to see this," he said. The first was a printed email from the investors. They were withdrawing all funding from Ethan's projects, citing reputational concerns. The second was a handwritten note. Vanessa's handwriting elegant and sharp. It said, "You've ruined us. I hope you're happy." I folded the note carefully and slid it into a drawer. "I'm not," I said quietly, "but I am done." The next morning, I turned on the news. The story had spread beyond Charleston. A talk show host read excerpts from the restaurant's viral moment, praising my composure. "That's how you handle disrespect with class," she said. Her audience clapped. I turned off the TV. The applause made me tired. By the end of the week, Ethan called. His voice sounded hollow, smaller than I remembered. "Mom, we're in trouble," he said. "The investors pulled out, the suppliers won't deliver. Even the PR company dropped us. We can't pay rent on the condo." I waited, listening to his breath shake on the other end. "Mom," he said again, voice cracking. "What do we do?" For a long time I said nothing. Then I spoke softly. "You rebuild, Ethan. The way your father and I did. Brick by brick. Honest work, not borrowed image." There was silence. Then a whisper. "Vanessa blames me." "She blamed me too," I said. But blaming is easier than changing. That night the city buzzed with gossip. Vanessa's friends unfollowed her sponsors, vanished, and the press started digging into her past. A journalist called me for comment. "Would you like to share how it feels to have karma delivered so perfectly?" she asked. I almost laughed. "Karma doesn't work for me," I said. "It works for truth." The following morning I found Vanessa's face on every local blog, smiling through old photographs captioned with stories of her fall. I couldn't bring myself to read them all. I knew humiliation when I saw it. I had tasted it once too. That afternoon I visited the flagship restaurant. The dining room was quiet between lunch and dinner service. Henry was reviewing invoices when I walked in. "They're talking about you everywhere," he said. "Even national news picked it up." "I don't care about that," I replied. "How's the staff?" He looked at me for a moment, surprised. "Relieved, actually. They're proud to work here again." "Good," I said. "Then give them something to be proud of." We sat together in my office, going over plans to start a community fund for single mothers in the hospitality industry. "It's not revenge," I told him. "It's legacy." Henry nodded. "You're turning the story around." "Stories can wound," I said, "but they can also heal. I'm choosing the second." 2 days later I received an envelope at home with no return address. Inside was a small folded note and $50 in cash. The handwriting was uneven. "I worked under your husband years ago. He gave me a second chance when nobody else would. I saw the news. Thank you for reminding me that decency still wins. M." I held the note against my chest. For the first time since everything began, I cried. Not from sadness, but from release. Later that evening I walked to the harbor, the one Ray and I used to visit when we were young. The air smelled of salt and rain. The water glimmered under the light of the old lighthouse. I whispered to the wind, "It's over now, Ray. They've learned." But as soon as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Ethan still hadn't come by, and despite the headlines, Vanessa wasn't finished. When I got home, my phone buzzed again. "Joan, of course." "You've seen the latest post?" she asked breathlessly. "No," I said, already dreading it. "She's claiming you tricked her, that the restaurant was never really yours. She's saying the paperwork's fake." I felt a strange calm wash over me. "Let her shout," I said. Noise doesn't change truth. Still, I opened the post. Vanessa's words were a mess of self-pity and rage. She used me. She always hated me. She wanted the world to see me fail. The comments below were turning on her fast, hundreds of people calling her a liar, a bully, a fraud. For a brief second, I saw a photo attached to her post. It was of Ethan, head in hands, sitting in an empty dining room. His face looked hollow, lost. And my heart cracked open just a little. I closed my phone and whispered to the empty room, "Enough, Gloria, mercy isn't weakness." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Ray's voice in my head. The sea will always bring back what's yours, but it might also bring back what you thought you'd buried. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted peace. But peace, I was learning, doesn't come without a price. When dawn came, I brewed a fresh pot of tea and stared out at the pale morning light stretching across the water. My phone buzzed again. "Ethan." "Mom," he said, voice breaking, "Vanessa's gone. She packed her things and left." "Then maybe," I said softly, "it's time you find out who you are without her." He was quiet for a long time. Then, almost in a whisper, "Can I come home?" I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. "You can come by," I said. "But we're not starting where we left off. We start honest this time." He exhaled a shaky breath. "Thank you." After the call, I walked to the table where my tea waited, still steaming. Outside, the lighthouse beam faded as the morning brightened. I took a sip and murmured, "Justice isn't about winning, it's about waking up." And in that quiet, I felt the first hint of something I hadn't felt in years, peace trying to find its way home. The knock came just after sunrise. I was in the kitchen watering the potted herbs when I heard it, soft, hesitant, almost like a question. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there, pale and thinner than I remembered, his hair a mess, eyes red from sleeplessness. He held a plain envelope in his hands. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. For a moment, I just looked at him. There was no anger left in me, only a strange kind of ache. "Come in," I said quietly. He stepped inside, looking around as if he hadn't seen the house in years. In truth, he hadn't. The furniture was the same, the smell of lemon polish still faint in the air. His voice was rough when he said, "It still smells like Dad's cooking in here." "I never changed much," I said. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table, folding and unfolding the envelope in his hands. "We lost everything, Mom. The investors, the accounts, the apartment. Vanessa left. She took her things, her jewelry, even the paintings. I have nothing left but debt." I poured tea for both of us and took a seat across from him. So I said calmly, "What do you need?" His throat worked before he spoke. "I don't want money. Not anymore. I don't know how to start over." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The sound of the clock ticking filled the space between us. I watched him the way I used to when he was a boy, when he'd scraped his knees and tried not to cry. "Start with honesty," I said at last. He nodded and pushed the envelope toward me. I opened it. Inside were copies of documents, bank transfers, contracts, one with my forged signature. My stomach tightened. "I did this," he said. "I thought if I moved things around, we could look successful enough to attract more investors. It was stupid. I know that now." I looked down at the papers. The guilt in his voice was real. "You destroyed what your father and I built for appearances." "I know," he whispered. "And I'd give anything to undo it." I closed the envelope and set it aside. "The only thing you can undo is who you choose to be now." He looked at me then, tears standing in his eyes. "I miss him, Mom. I miss Dad." The words cracked something in me. I had wanted him to say that for years, to remember his father not as a man in a photo, but as the reason everything existed. "So do I," said softly. "Every day." We sat there for a long moment, two people bound by loss, both finally looking at what had broken us. After a while he spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. "Can I make it right?" I took a deep breath. "That depends on what you mean by right." He met my eyes. "I want to work. I don't care where. I want to earn my way back." I studied him carefully, searching for pride, for the arrogance that had once filled every corner of his words. It wasn't there. Only humility, raw and unsteady. "You'll start small," I said. "In the kitchen. As an employee, not as my son. You'll listen, you'll learn, and you'll respect every person who stands beside you. He nodded without hesitation. Yes, ma'am. That answer, respectful and simple, did more to heal me than any apology ever could. Later that morning, I drove him to the flagship restaurant. The air was crisp, the smell of salt thick on the breeze. Henry met us at the door, surprise flickering across his face. Mrs. Bennet, he greeted, then his gaze fell on Ethan. He's starting today, I said. Henry raised an eyebrow but nodded. Dish station's short-staffed. He can start there. Ethan didn't flinch. Thank you, he said. I watched as he tied an apron around his waist, his expensive watch replaced by a plain rubber band to hold his sleeve up. The sight tugged at something deep inside me. This was my son, not the man who had humiliated me in front of strangers, but the boy who had once helped his father peel shrimp in the back kitchen, laughing when the shells stuck to his fingers. I stayed long enough to see him scrub the first stack of pots. Then I turned to leave. Henry caught up to me outside. You really think he'll stick with it? I smiled faintly. He has no choice but to. And maybe that's the best thing that could happen to him. That evening the house felt quieter, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet. I walked through the garden, the hydrangeas heavy with new blooms. I thought about Ray, how he used to say forgiveness wasn't about weakness but about timing. Catch him once, he'd said. Then let him walk again. Maybe this was that moment. The next day Ethan showed up early at the restaurant. Henry called me at noon. He's working hard, he said. No complaints, no shortcuts. The crew respects him. Good, I replied. Respect is where rebuilding begins. That night, Ethan came by the house, still smelling faintly of onions and soap. He looked exhausted but proud. I cleaned 6 stock pots, he said with a tired laugh. Burned my hand on the steamer. Did you learn something? I asked. He nodded. That every job I thought I was too good for is harder than I ever imagined. I smiled. That's called humility. It stays longer than success. He sat across from me drinking the tea I'd poured without asking. It feels different, Mom. Working for something instead of pretending to have it. That's because it's real, I said. Real things take time. Before he left, he hesitated at the door. Thank you for letting me back in, he said quietly. I touched his arm. You're not back in yet, Ethan. You're just at the door. But you're facing the right way this time. When the door closed behind him, I stood there for a while, the night air moving gently through the house. I felt something loosen inside me, like the knot that had lived in my chest for years had finally begun to untangle. I walked to the window where the beam of the lighthouse cut across the water. It wasn't as bright as it used to be, but it was steady. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a single act. It was a staircase. And Ethan had just taken the first step. I whispered into the quiet, "Good night, my son." And for the first time in a long while the word son didn't feel heavy. It felt whole. The first day Ethan worked in the kitchen, the morning light hadn't even reached the dining room windows. The air smelled of coffee and bleach, the floors freshly mopped, the ovens humming awake. He stood there in his crisp apron shoulders, stiff eyes uncertain. The kitchen crew, mostly younger cooks who had only heard of him through gossip, pretended not to stare. Henry handed him a towel. Start with the produce, he said. Peel, wash, chop. No waste. Ethan nodded. Yes, sir. I watched from the doorway, quiet, unseen. He moved clumsily at first, his hands unused to real labor. The knife slipped once, slicing too deep into a tomato, splattering red across the board. He froze, embarrassed, but didn't speak. The dishwasher, Rosa, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, smirked. Out there you wore suits, she said. In here you wear the truth. The others laughed softly, not cruelly, but with the kind of amusement that tests newcomers. Ethan's face flushed. He nodded, cleaned the board, and kept working. By mid-morning the kitchen had found its rhythm. Pots clanged, steam rose, orders were called. Ethan's sleeves were rolled, his hair damp from heat. He didn't complain when Henry told him to wipe the counters or haul boxes from the freezer. He just did it. When he burned his hand on a pan, handle instinct made me take a step forward, but Henry was already there with ice and bandages. Ethan winced, muttering, "I'm fine." Henry's tone was steady. Pain's part of the job. It teaches you faster than comfort. Ethan nodded. Guess I'm learning a lot then. Good, Henry said. Keep going. That afternoon, I joined them for the staff meal. The crew sat around a long prep table eating soup and bread, laughing about orders gone wrong, and customers who demanded too much salt. Ethan sat at the end quiet, spooning soup, as if it were both punishment and prayer. One of the line cooks, a broad man named Luis, leaned toward him. How's it feel to be on the other side, boss man? Ethan smiled faintly. Feels humbling. Good, Luis said. Humility makes food taste better. Rosa grinned. So does sweat. The laughter rippled again, and this time Ethan laughed with them. I watched from a distance, feeling something warm and strange bloom in my chest. For the first time in years, my son wasn't pretending. He was living. That evening, as the last guests left and the lights dimmed, Ethan stayed to mop the floor. I waited for him near the door. He didn't see me until the final stroke. His hands were red from the water, his back slightly bent, but there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Long day, I said softly. He turned, startled, then smiled. The longest. Did you learn anything? He leaned on the mop. That hard work doesn't kill you, it just makes you honest. I nodded. Your father would have liked that answer. He wiped sweat from his forehead. I thought about him a lot today. So did I. When I left, the street outside smelled of salt and fried garlic. The lighthouse beam swept the water like it always did, steady, patient. The next week, Ethan worked every day. He arrived early, stayed late, took criticism without flinching. I made sure he earned the same pay as the other kitchen hands. The first time he picked up his check, he stared at it for a long time. This is what I used to spend in an afternoon, he said quietly. And yet, I said you worked harder for it than anything else you've had. He folded it neatly and slipped it into his pocket. It feels different. It feels clean. One afternoon during the lunch rush, I stood behind the service counter watching him move from station to station. He wasn't graceful yet, but there was rhythm now, passing plates, timing orders, wiping spills without being asked. The crew had stopped watching him as an outsider. They joked with him, teased him, treated him like one of their own. I caught Henry's eye across the kitchen. He gave a small nod. When the final order went out, Ethan leaned against the counter, catching his breath. I finally get it, he said. What? Why Dad loved this? The noise, the chaos, it feels alive. I smiled. It always did. That night we had tea together at my house. His hands were rough, his nails lined with tiny cuts. I noticed how carefully he held the cup, as though remembering old manners. It's strange, he said, after a while. All these years I thought success meant being seen. But in that kitchen, nobody looks at you unless you're needed. It's humbling and peaceful. That's leadership, I said. The kind that lasts. He looked up, startled. Leadership. Real leaders serve first. You can't guide others until you've walked where they stand. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the tea. Then I have a lot of walking left to do. Before he left, he paused by the door. Mom, thank you for letting me earn my way back. I don't deserve it, but thank you. You don't deserve it yet, I said gently. But you're getting there. After he was gone, I sat for a while by the window listening to the wind. My reflection looked softer than it had in years. The anger that used to live in my chest had thinned, replaced by something steadier. Forgiveness maybe. Or just relief. A few days later I visited the restaurant again. The kitchen was alive with the sound of sizzling pans. Ethan was plating food beside Rosa when a customer at the front complained loudly about a delayed order. Without hesitation, Ethan went to the table, apologized, and offered dessert on the house. The man's expression softened immediately. From across the room, Henry met my eyes, smiling. I felt something loosen inside me, pride simple and unadorned. That night when the kitchen closed, I called Ethan into my office. He stood at attention like a soldier. You've done well, I said. Thank you. But this isn't about making me proud. It's about earning your own respect. He nodded. I understand. I studied his face for a long time. There was humility there now, but also quiet strength. Then we're getting somewhere, I said. When he left, the air felt lighter. I looked out through the glass wall toward the harbor, the waves catching light from the distant lighthouse. It struck me how far we'd come since the night he'd told me to leave this place. As I gathered my things to go home, Henry appeared in the doorway. He's changed, he said. Yes, I replied. Pain has a way of teaching what pride never can. Henry hesitated. And if Vanessa comes back, I smiled faintly. Then we'll see what she's learned too. Outside, the night was quiet except for the hum of the sea. I locked the door behind me, breathing in the salt air. For years, I'd dreamed of revenge. Now, watching my son walk the path of humility, I realized this was better. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, it transformed it. I whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Ray, he's finally learning." The lighthouse flashed once more across the water, as if answering. I took it as a promise that the lesson wasn't over yet, but maybe, just maybe, it was beginning to mean something. The knock came late that night, long after the restaurant had closed. I was in my office finishing payroll when Henry appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Bennet," he said quietly, "there's someone here asking to see you." His voice carried that careful tone he used when bad news wore a polite face. When I stepped into the dining room, the only light came from the bar lamps. Vanessa stood near the entrance, wrapped in a beige coat that looked 2 sizes too big, her hair unbrushed, her makeup gone. She clutched a worn purse against her chest like a shield. "I know I shouldn't be here," she said. "But please, 10 minutes. I nodded once. 10 minutes. She followed me to a corner booth, the same one where she had once ordered waiters around, as if they were invisible. Now she sat hunched, her hands trembling on the table. "I've lost everything," she began. "My followers, the sponsors, even the condo. Ethan's working, but he won't talk to me. His family won't talk to me. I thought if I came here, to what I asked, ask for forgiveness or ask for help." She flinched. "Maybe both." The silence stretched between us, heavy but not hostile. Outside, the sound of rain brushed against the windows. "I know what you must think of me," she said. "And you're not wrong. I was cruel. I thought respect meant power, and power meant money. I didn't understand that you can't buy dignity." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I understand that now." I folded my hands on the table. Understanding is one thing. Living it is another. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "These are what's left of the bank cards and keys. Everything I still had tied to the restaurants. I don't deserve them. I didn't take the envelope." "You're right, you don't, not yet." She lowered her eyes. "When the video went viral, I thought it was the end of my life. People I called friends mocked me. Strangers sent me messages telling me I got what I deserved. And they weren't wrong. But then one morning I looked at my son and realized he barely knew me. He thought I was the woman from those headlines, the liar, the villain. That's when I knew I had to come here." Her words caught me off guard. There was no performance in her tone, now only exhaustion. "What is it you want, Vanessa?" "I want to work," she said. "Not for charity. For a chance to do something right." I studied her face, searching for the old sharpness, the calculation. It wasn't there. Just a kind of fragile resolve. "You want to work here," I said. "If you'll let me." I leaned back in the booth, weighing the request. The memory of her laughter that night sit at the servants' table, Gloria, still burned like acid. But across from me sat a woman stripped of everything but remorse. I thought of Ray again, his voice echoing in memory. "Mercy isn't weakness, love. It's choosing not to become what hurt you." Henry I called softly. He appeared a moment later. "Yes, ma'am. Tomorrow morning Mrs. Bennet will report to marketing. Minimum wage. She'll answer to you." Henry's brow lifted slightly, but he only nodded. "Understood." Vanessa blinked. "You'd hire me, after everything?" "No," I said. "I'm not hiring you. You'll earn your place. And you'll start where you burned the bridge." She swallowed hard. "I will." When she stood, I noticed her hands, nails, chipped knuckles raw from cold. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me," I said. "Just show me." After she left, Henry lingered by the booth. "You're sure about this?" I stared at the rain-streaked window. "No. But forgiveness is a risk worth taking once." The next morning Vanessa arrived before dawn. She wore a plain blouse and jeans, her hair tied back, no trace of her old glamour. I watched from the office window as Henry handed her a clipboard and introduced her to the rest of the staff. There were murmurs, curious glances, a few tense smiles. But she didn't flinch. She started sorting files, labeling folders, answering phones. Quiet, focused, invisible, the opposite of who she had been. Around noon, Ethan appeared at the door carrying a crate of produce from the delivery truck. He froze when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" he asked. She looked up, her voice calm. "Working." He blinked, unsure whether to believe it. "Mom hired you, she gave me a chance," Vanessa said. "That's all." Ethan looked at me standing a few steps behind her. I nodded once. "Everyone earns their second chance here," I said. He hesitated, then gave a small nod back. "Then I guess I'll see you at lunch." The day passed quietly. I found myself watching them both from a distance, Ethan wiping tables, Vanessa updating menus. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it was civil, careful. Something small but real was starting to shift. That evening, Vanessa came into my office with a printout in her hand. "I drafted a new community program," she said. "A campaign to support women in the service industry. Part of the profits could go to single mothers." I took the paper, scanning it. The plan was simple but solid. "You thought of this," she nodded. "After the video, I got letters from women who'd worked as waitresses, some saying they'd been treated like I treated you. I wanted to do something for them. For once, something good." For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I looked up. "All right, we'll pilot it next month." Her lips parted in surprise. "You're serious, completely. You started a fire, Vanessa. Now use it to light something better." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't speak. She simply nodded and left the office. When the restaurant emptied, and the night grew still, I stayed behind, sitting at the same table where it had all begun. The memory of that night flashed through me, the mocking laughter, the sting of shame, the words that had cut so deep. But as I looked around the room now, the air felt different. Softer. Henry returned with the closing report. "You did the right thing," he said. Maybe, I answered. Or maybe I'm just tired of watching people break when they could still bend. He smiled faintly. "That's what makes you better than them." I turned off the last light and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening. The lighthouse beam swept over the harbor steady as ever. I breathed in the salt air and whispered, "Revenge gives you victory, mercy gives you peace." And for the first time, I felt both. 6 months later, the smell of fresh paint filled the air, as sunlight spilled through the front windows of the restaurant. A new sign hung above the entrance, "The New Harbor." I stood across the street, coffee in hand, watching the workers add the final polish to the gold letters. It shimmered under the morning light like a quiet promise. Inside, Ethan was setting up tables with practiced movements, folding napkins into neat triangles. Vanessa was arranging flowers at the hostess stand, her hand steady and sure. Henry walked between them, checking lists and giving instructions. It was the first time in years I'd seen my restaurant alive in a way that wasn't just about profit but about purpose. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Henry said, joining me by the door. "It's more than that," I said softly. "It's reborn." He smiled. "You know, they work well together now." "Strange, considering." "I remember," I said. "It's strange, yes. But sometimes the storm clears the air better than silence ever could." When I stepped inside, Ethan looked up and grinned. "Mom, we're almost ready for inspection." "I can see that," I said. "You've done good work." Vanessa straightened a vase of white tulips, glancing toward me nervously. "The table's near the windows. Should I use the linen napkins or the cotton ones?" "Cotton," I said. "They breathe better." She nodded. "Got it." The tone was respectful, quiet, the arrogance that once defined her was gone. I didn't trust it at first, but 6 months of showing up early, staying late, and doing her work without complaint had changed something in her. She didn't talk about followers or sponsors anymore, she just worked. At noon, the health inspector came and left impressed. Henry handled the paperwork while Ethan and Vanessa cleaned the kitchen. When everything was finally silent, I poured 3 cups of tea and motioned for them to sit. "I think we're ready to open," I said. Ethan exhaled. "Feels like the first time all over again." "It is," I said. "But this time, you both know what it costs." Vanessa looked down at her hands. "Thank you for giving me a place here," she said quietly. "I still don't know if I deserve it." "Deserving isn't the point," I said. "It's what you do with the chance that matters." The next week, the restaurant opened its doors to the public again. We didn't advertise much, just a handwritten sign that said, "Now open. Honest food, honest work." People remembered. The first customers were old regulars who hugged me and cried. Some came out of curiosity, whispering about the viral story that had started it all. But once they tasted the food, the gossip stopped. The dishes spoke for themselves, Ray's recipes made fresh by hands that had finally learned humility. Ethan moved through the dining room with calm confidence, checking on guests, thanking the staff. Vanessa stood by the bar, helping with reservations, occasionally glancing my way for reassurance. I gave her a nod each time. She earned that much. At the end of the first week, we'd sold out every night. The new menu was simple hearty seafood gumbo, baked oysters, lemon pie. The same flavors that built everything, just refined with care. The team gathered after closing, exhausted but smiling. Ethan leaned against the counter. "We did it!" "No," I corrected. "You worked for it." He laughed softly. "You sound like Dad." I smiled. "Good. Maybe that means I've finally learned to say things the way he did." Vanessa handed out cups of cider. "To the new beginning," she said. Henry raised his glass. "To the harbor that survived every storm." We all clinked our cups together. For a moment, there was nothing but warmth, laughter, tired smiles, the quiet hum of the refrigerators in the background. I looked around and realized this was the family I'd been trying to rebuild all along. Not perfect, not unbroken, but honest. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my office with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. At the top, I wrote "Letter of Legacy." To whoever leads the harbor after me, I began remember that food is just an excuse to gather souls. Respect your staff, cherish your guests, and never confuse wealth with worth. Dignity is not inherited, it's earned daily. When I finished, I folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope. I placed it in the safe next to a faded photo of Ray taken on our first opening night. His grin was wide flour dusting his cheek. I touched the photo gently. "We made it, Ray," I whispered. The next morning the sunlight hit the new sign outside just as we unlocked the doors. A line had already formed, locals, families, curious tourists. Among them was a familiar face, the older man who had been an investor that night of the confrontation. He approached me with a warm smile. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, "I came to see what dignity tastes like." I laughed softly. "It tastes a lot like lemon pie." He smiled. "Then I'll take 2 slices." Inside the restaurant buzzed with life. The music was soft, the kitchen loud in the best way. Ethan carried trays, Vanessa handled guests, Henry directed the flow like a conductor. I stood by the hostess stand, watching it all, every movement, every detail, every person who had helped rebuild what pride had once tried to destroy. Around noon, Liam came running through the door with a small backpack and chocolate on his cheek. "Grandma!" he shouted. I bent down, hugging him tight. "You came to visit." "Daddy said, this is our restaurant," he said proudly. "Can I help?" I smiled. "Only if you promise to wash your hands." He laughed and ran to Ethan, who lifted him up easily. The sight of them together, father and son working side by side, brought a lump to my throat. For so long I had feared the legacy would die with me. Now I saw it living in their gestures, their laughter, the way Ethan taught Liam to fold napkins just so. By evening the restaurant glowed like a lantern. People lingered long after dessert, savoring the comfort that only real things bring. When the last guests left, Ethan turned to me. "We're booked solid for the next 3 weeks, then we'd better keep earning it," I said. He grinned. "Yes, ma'am." As we locked up, Vanessa lingered near the door. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not giving up on me." "I almost did," I admitted. "But sometimes grace shows up when you least deserve it." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'll keep proving it." Outside, the harbor lights danced on the water, steady and bright. I stood there for a long while, breathing in the salt air, letting the peace settle in. "For years I begged for a place at their table," I murmured. "Now I've built one big enough for all of us." The beam of the lighthouse swept across the sky, calm, unwavering. It didn't look like a warning anymore. It looked like home. The restaurant was silent again. The last guests had gone, the lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, and the ocean outside hummed faintly beyond the glass windows. I sat at the same corner table where everything had started, the one where Vanessa once told me to sit with the servants. Tonight, a single slice of lemon pie rested on a plate before me, the scent of citrus and butter filling the still air. I took the first bite slowly. It tasted exactly as it had when Ray and I baked it the first time, sharp, sweet, honest. They once told me I didn't belong at their table, but here I was sitting at mine, surrounded by the life we rebuilt. The laughter of the staff echoed faintly from the kitchen. Ethan was closing registers, Vanessa wiping down counters. The sound was steady, rhythmic, the heartbeat of something that had almost died but refused to stay buried. I leaned back and looked around the room. Every table gleamed, every chair stood firm. The walls still carried faint traces of our past, framed photos of the early days, Ray's handwriting painted on the beam near the bar. Honest food, honest work. I whispered the words aloud, smiling. You'd be proud, Ray. When I closed my eyes, I could see him again, standing behind the counter, flour on his hands, laughter on his lips. If we ever make it, he once told me, promise me we'll never forget what respect tastes like. I kept that promise. The memories came in waves, the night of humiliation, the silence after Ethan's betrayal the first time. I stood my ground and said no. I thought I'd buried those nights, but they returned now, not to hurt me, but to remind me how far I'd come. Respect, I realized, wasn't a gift anyone could take away. It was something you built layer by layer, like a crust holding its shape through heat. The kitchen door swung open softly. Ethan appeared, wiping his hands on a towel. We're done for the night, he said. The staff wanted to say goodnight, but I told them you'd earned a little quiet. I smiled. Quiet's good. He hesitated, then sat down across from me. The dim light softened his face, but I could still see the boy he'd once been, the one who used to sneak spoonfuls of lemon filling when he thought I wasn't looking. Dad would have been proud, he said. So would I answered. He looked down, fidgeting with the edge of the napkin. Mom, I know I've said I'm sorry before, but I don't think I ever said thank you. Not just for forgiving me, but for letting me fail until I learned. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Failing isn't the worst thing, Ethan. Forgetting who you are, that's what breaks people. He nodded, eyes shining. I'll never forget again. Vanessa joined us a moment later, apron still tied around her waist. She looked different now, no heavy makeup, no polished facade, just the quiet steadiness of someone who'd found humility. The register's balanced, she said, then hesitated. Can I sit? Of course, I said. She took the seat beside Ethan, glancing around the dining room. You know, I used to think success meant applause, she said. Now I think it just means going home proud of how you treated people. That's a better definition, I said, and one that lasts longer. For a moment, the three of us sat in silence. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint roll of the waves outside. Then Ethan broke the stillness. We're hosting a charity dinner next month for the Harbor Hearts Fund. Half the proceeds will go to single mothers in the restaurant industry. Vanessa organized it. I turned to her, surprised. You did, she nodded. I wanted to give back somehow. To women who remind me of you, the ones who work quietly, the ones people overlook. Emotion rose in my chest, sharp as salt water. That's a good thing to build, I said. Kindness leaves the strongest legacy. When they left for the night, I stayed behind. The restaurant felt alive even in stillness. I walked to the window and looked out at the harbor. The lighthouse beam swept across the waves in a slow, graceful arc, the same way it had for decades. I'd watched that light through grief, through betrayal, through redemption. Tonight it didn't look like a warning. It looked like a guide. I thought of all the women who might be listening to this story somewhere, women who'd been silenced, belittled, told they didn't belong. I wanted them to know what I had learned too late. You don't need to beg for a seat at someone else's table. You can build your own, even if it takes a lifetime. I gathered my things, but before I turned off the lights, I wrote a note on the back of a receipt and pinned it to the staff board. Respect doesn't taste like victory. It tastes like calm. The next morning the restaurant was full again. Families, couples, old regulars. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Liam ran around between tables carrying napkins and giggling when Henry pretended to chase him. I watched him from the corner, my heart full. Ethan and Vanessa worked side by side without friction. They didn't need to prove anything anymore. They just belonged. After the lunch rush, Ethan brought me a plate, a single slice of lemon pie, with a fork resting beside it. "For you," he said. I smiled. "It never gets old." "It shouldn't," he said. "It's the taste of everything you built." When I took a bite, the sweetness filled my chest with warmth. For the first time, the flavor wasn't tied to memory or loss. It was peace, plain and simple. Later that evening, as the sun dipped into the sea, I walked outside to the edge of the dock. The wind lifted my hair, the salt air cool against my face. The lighthouse flashed once, twice. I whispered to the horizon, "We did it, Ray, the harbor's safe." Then turning back toward the restaurant, I saw its sign glowing softly, the new harbor reflecting off the glass. Behind that glow was everything I had fought for: dignity, forgiveness, and the quiet strength that comes from choosing to rise without shouting. I faced the invisible audience I knew was out there somewhere, the women who would hear my story. "If someone's ever told you that you don't belong," I said softly, "remember this. Respect isn't something they give you. It's something you reclaim. And when you do, it tastes sweeter than revenge ever could." I paused, smiling to myself. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Have you ever built your own harbor after a storm? The water shimmered beneath the lighthouse's beam. I breathed in the night and whispered my final thought. Justice served. Peace earned. Dignity restored. That's what respect tastes like.